Everyone, this is Mr. Peak and welcome to the second part of the lesson, Conditional Statements and Inputs. In this second part of the lesson we will be looking into data types, and then there's some extension work based around expanding our if statements to consider other options that the user might enter. So, in Python there are many things what we call data types, and there are many different ones. So far in these lessons you will have heard me refer to what we call a string. And I've said before that is just a mixture of text and numbers that the computer knows is text, so it ignores it, and in the context of a print statement it'll just put it onto the screen. It doesn't register it as code. But then we have two others that we'll need to start using as we move forward that you need to know about. So the second one is an integer. You might have heard this term in maths along with float. An integer is a whole number and a float is just decimal numbers. So in Python, it's a little bit smart. When you create a variable, it will often assume the data type that you want to assign to it. So for example, this is why it's important. So I'm going to create a variable in Create with Code in a moment that's called my number. And I'm going to let the user enter a number. And then I'm going to do print my number, add my number. So I'm going to add these two numbers together. And have a little think now what you think is going to happen. So I'm going to move over to Create with Code, and I'm going to create that. So my number equals input enter. And then it's print my number plus my number. So what I'm going to assume most of you are thinking now is it's going to add the number that I enter against the number that I enter. So we're going to get, if let's say I entered 5, it'll do 5 plus 5 and we'll get the answer of 10. So let's run this and see what happens. So let's enter 5 and press OK. We can see here that I got 55. That's because, and this is going to take a little bit of explaining, when we use an input like this, the default data type, remember thinking back to the presentation, the default data type that is assigned to that input is a string. So the computer considered what we entered as a string. So what it's doing in Create with Code is it's merging two strings together. It's adding two strings together. Just like we did in the extension task last week. It's putting 5 and 5 together and it's making 55 instead of adding, because it can't add strings together, it just merges them. So what we would need to do is tell the computer that what we're entering is a number. So to do that, in Create with Code, all I need to do is say here is int, and then add another bracket there, and then add another bracket at the end. So I'm saying, right, well my number, well firstly it's going to be a number, it's going to be a whole number, and then I'm just going to let them input like normal. So now if I print, if I enter 5, well the computer now knows that whatever I'm entering is a number. So when I press OK, it now knows that number add number, because they're whole numbers, it's going to add them like it would normally on a calculator, and it'll give me the answer of 10. If I tried to enter something like that, it doesn't know what to do with it because that's text. It's not a number, so the computer gives me an error because it doesn't know what to do because it was expecting me to enter a number. So remember, if we get rid of that, the computer considers whatever we enter to be a string text. So I could do hello, and if I press OK, it just says hello twice because it's adding the two strings together. It's adding another version of hello onto the end. So we need to consider this when we start creating programs that require data types. So if I move back over to the presentation, there we go, and move on to the next slide. So when you think about creating variables, you have to consider what data type you're going to give it. So for example, if we were asking someone to input their age, well, we know that probably anyone over the age of 3 probably isn't going to give the answer 12 and a half. They're just going to say, 12, 57, 14. They're just going to give a whole number. So we know that that data type will be an integer. So we'd say int age. But a shoe size, well, someone could be a size 6, they could be a size 6.5, 10.5, or a 10. So we know we need the option to allow the user to enter a decimal number. So here we would say float, because that's a decimal number. The same with price, that will be a decimal number at times, because the price of something could be £2.50, £5, so we need the option to allow the user to have a whole number or a decimal. Now a postcode is where it gets a little bit more sort of complicated. We have a mixture out of numbers and text. So we know that needs to be a string, because a string is a mixture of numbers and text. So if we tried to add postcode onto postcode, we would get that twice. And again, with height, we would need a float. The quantity, well, you're never going to have 12.5 pairs of shoes in stock, because if you've just got one shoe, you're not going to be able to sell it. So we know that the quantity in stock will always be a whole number, so we would use integer. So when you create variables, you need to think about, if you're going to use it in a way that's not a default string, what you're going to assign to it. The lucky thing is, you will only need to do that if you use an input. Python is relatively smart at using base variables and assigning the correct data type. So let me show you that in Create with Code and how that works. So over to Create with Code. Here we've got the example of using an input. If instead of the input we just say my number will always equal 5, and then do print my number, add my number, Python is going to be really smart and say, well, I know that 5 is a number, it's a whole number, an integer, so it's going to assign the default data type to this variable as an integer. So if we click run, it gives me the answer of 10. If we change this and put 10, we'll get the answer of 20, because 10 add 10 is 20. So if you enter a sort of a value manually to a variable, instead of allowing the user to input it, it always gives it the correct data type. So if I entered hello here, go away caps lock warning, there we go. If I enter hello, and you need to make sure that it's in speech marks, it's text, well then Python correctly assumes that you've wanted this data type to be a string, because it's in speech marks, and we get hello, hello, because it's saying, well, hello plus hello equals hello, hello. So if you are creating a variable with a default value, you need to make sure, well, you don't need to do anything, because Python, makes the correct choice and assumes the data type that you want it to be, and it's generally correct. But if you're using an input, well then Python always assumes that it's a string. So you need to make sure so that if you are entering a number, that you declare it as a number. So if I enter here, again, Python assumes that this is going to be a string that you enter, but we don't want it to be a string, we want it to be a number. So we need to tell Python that we're entering an int, which stands for integer, it's short for integer, and then click run, and again we have that correct answer. Let's say we wanted to enter a decimal number. Well, if we try to run this, well, we're telling Python that we're going to enter a whole number, because an integer means a whole number. But I'm not going to do that. So I've got an error, because Python was assuming that I'm entering a whole number, an integer, but I entered what is instead a float. So we would need to change this to a float if we wanted to enter a decimal number. And then let's try and run this. So 5.5. Well, then it correctly adds them together, because Python now knows that we've entered a float. And again, a float works for a whole number too, because it's a whole number and decimal numbers. Again, the default sort of assigning is correct, because if we just manually say 5.5 as what this variable equals, then it correctly assumes that it's a float and says 11. So again, if you are creating a variable where you as the programmer are assigning the variable to the assigning the data to the variable, Python will correctly assume the correct data type. So again, a string, a whole number, or a decimal number, Python will correctly assign the correct data type. It's only when you go to use input that Python always, no matter what, decides that it's going to be a string. No matter what you enter, it'll always be a string. So you will need to manually tell Python that it's an integer or a float, or you could enter, I can't remember which one that is. Let me go to the PowerPoint. str, there we go. So str is short for string, and that will assign it as a string. So hopefully that makes sense. It's a little bit difficult to do over video. If you are confused by this, just put a message in the Teams chat. Or at this point, if we're in live lessons, I should be able to go over it live, like back in person. But for now, let's move on. So the fourth task I want you to do, you will have to make use of those data types. So you're going to practice assigning data types to an input. Because what I'm going to do, or what you're going to do, sorry, is create a program that asks the user their age. So if we're asking someone their age, what data type do we think that's going to be? So if I hop back over to this table, well, we know that anyone over the age of 3 isn't going to say 12.5, so we can safely assume that that will be a whole number. So think about which data type you're going to have to assign to the input of age, and then we're going to check the user's age against some different conditions using if statements. So if the user is over 18, then they are an adult. If they are 16 or over, then they are not an adult yet, but can drive. If they are under 16, they are still a child. Else, ask them to enter their age again. So, if I quickly walk you through again. So, if the user is 18 or over, they are an adult. But remember, you can't use if more than once in Python. We can use it more than once in English because it makes sense and it works, because we don't get errors in real life. But in Python, we will get an error if we used if. So remember, elif, else. So what I want you to do is pause the video here and complete this task. Again, if you're confused, I can give you a little bit more help because we should be in live lessons at this point. But please pause the video and complete the task. Okay, so hopefully you completed that task without any struggles. This is the end of the main video content. So this is the stuff that you should learn this lesson. In a moment, I'm going to go over the extension work and extension tasks for this lesson. So this week it's not a separate video because I thought I'd make it all one to make it a bit easier for you. So I'm going to move on to the main extension tasks now. Please make sure that before you move on to the extension tasks, that you've completed all of the tasks in the main lesson. Okay? So, let's take a look at the extension work. With conditional statements, which are if statements, we can add extra conditions to stop what we call logical errors. But what are logical errors? Well, let me move over to Create with Code and show you. Because we've looked at syntax errors, which are, let me move over to my menu to make it a bit easier. So we know what syntax errors are. Syntax errors are errors with our syntax. That means the program doesn't work. But what we call logical errors are your program runs, but not as you want it to. So it works, but it doesn't work as you want it to. So let's say you've got the Just Eat app in front of you now, and you enter pizza with a capital P. Well, let's run that and enter pizza with a capital P. Well, we know that works. Pizza is a great choice. We saw that work earlier. Well, let's try now entering pizza, but without a capital letter. We know that we want pizza, but will the program? We don't serve that here. Please make another choice. But we know for a fact that pizza is an option. And we know that we can enter pizza because we've done that before. But look here, we've entered it with a lowercase p. And here we're comparing it against pizza with an uppercase P. So again, pizza with a capital P. It works, with a lowercase p, it doesn't. So why not? Well, remember, computers are stupid, and we have to be very specific in the options and the choices and the way we program it. So here, we've only given it one thing to compare against, pizza with a capital P. We've not given it wrong spellings or pizza with a lowercase p to compare against. So this is the only input that will work. So we need to find a way to give it different options, and this is what we call a logical error. We know that we want pizza, but the computer doesn't because we spelt it differently than what's intended. Okay, so moving back to the PowerPoint, we need to find a way to add extra conditions to our if statement to cover all options that the user could enter. So we can do this by using the word or in our if statement. So here you can see that I've got a line of code that I've added this to. So if menu choice is equal to pizza, or menu choice is equal to pizza, and I've done it with a lowercase p there, we'll then say print pizza is a great choice. So let's move back over to create with code and add the option into our code here. So here you can see I've got my line of code just as normal, menu choice equal to pizza. Well, I want to add another option to compare it against. So I'm going to get rid of my semicolon for now, and I'm going to type the word or, just O-R. You can see there it's turned like a purplish colour. Well, then I can say menu choice, so I'm using the name of my variable again that the user used to input, right there. And I'm going to say equal to again, but this time pizza with a lowercase p. Then I need to make sure that I use my semicolon at the end of my line of code. So now if I try to run this and enter pizza all lowercase, well, now it says pizza is a great choice. Well, what happens if I try to run this but I spell pizza wrong? Oh, pizza wrong. Well, I think it would be safe to assume from a waiter that we want pizza because we spelt it like we normally would, but maybe we've accidentally missed a Z off when we've entered what we want. So what if we want it to say, you know, pizza's a great choice? Well, then again, we could use another or, along with naming the variable again, equal to pizza. So again, we're covering all the possible options that the user could enter. So click run, pizza's a great choice. So when you as a programmer come to create bigger programs, you need to start thinking of all of the possible options that the user could enter. The same with pie. It's hard to misspell pie, so maybe we just spell it with a lowercase p. So I'll need to say menu choice. Ooh. Is equal to pi. So now if we try and run this program and enter pi all lowercase, our pies are made fresh today. So all we've done is just added extra conditions that can be met depending on our input. We've just added extra options to our program. So if we move back over to the presentation, what I want you to do is expand that program you created earlier in this lesson, asking the user about their favourite TV shows. So you were asked to create if statements based on The Mandalorian, WandaVision and Stranger Things. What I want you to do is now expand the options, because if we move all the way back to this task, we can see here that the only spelling I gave you was The Mandalorian with a capital T and a capital M. But what if I, as the user, entered The Mandalorian without capitalising it, with just using all lowercase letters? Well, then it'll tell me that it doesn't match. I've not seen it. So I need to make sure that I've added all of those possible options into my program to ensure that no matter which variation of the spelling the user enters, that it registers it as the TV show that they've watched. So what I want you to do now is just expand that program using the skills I've just shown you by using the OR statement to add those extra options into that program, and then save that and then upload it to Teams, please, or show me in the live lesson if we're back. So that is the end of this lesson and the end of these extension tasks. Please ask if you need some extra help or demoing with this task. I know it's a little bit difficult to retroactively go back to a program and add to it. So please let me know if you need help. Otherwise, please complete this task. Okay, thanks for listening, everyone.